Hello guys, hope you're doing great. It's been some time since I've uploaded a video. And to be honest, I wasn't really happy about that, but I was looking for a job, and that was my main focus at the time. It took some looking and searching around, but eventually I got a job. And with that, I also had to move to a new place, so it took me some time to settle. But now things are good, so I decided to get back on YouTube. And also I have a new setup, as you guys can see. Nothing fancy really, just some artworks at the back to add a bit of flourish. Anyways, let's get to the point, what you guys are really here for. So today I'll be going back to the gesture drawing and anatomy, as you guys really liked my earlier video on the topic. Actually, this was the last video that I was working on before taking a break. I couldn't get it past the script and a few screen recordings. So I decided to get back with completing and uploading the video. So today I'll be talking about the importance of shapes and forms in drawing, and also building upon the ideas of gesture drawing and anatomy. So let's begin, shall we? Before getting into the development of anatomy, it is important to understand the basic geometrical forms and how to keep a consistent feeling of a form. So guys, here you can see these basic shapes on the canvas. When learning to draw, it is often emphasized that one should understand and practice drawing the basic geometry, such as lines, circles, squares, etc. Even when drawing a subject, it is really helpful to break down what you're seeing into 2D shapes. What it does is that it allows you to see the overall contour of your subject, without getting overwhelmed by the details at the start. Once the initial layout is established, you can then focus on the various levels of details. And you can see that it works with human figures quite well. Now, let's say you want to draw a character, but you do not have a reference. Or maybe you have a reference, but you want to turn the camera around a bit. What will you do then? Just like in mathematics, there is another level to understanding geometry when drawing figures, and that is 3D. And this brings us to the idea of forms. Now you must be familiar with these basic shapes. We have a sphere, a cube or a cuboid depending on the dimensions, and a cylinder. Just now, I talked about breaking down what we can see in a reference into 2D shapes and then create a layout. But here, what I'm talking about is going below the surface, what we often cannot see directly, the underlying shapes and forms that govern the working of a human figure. Talking about my earlier video on figure drawing, you might recognize this image. If you haven't watched the video, I'll link it on the screen. So here, I talked about the three main anatomical masses, the head, the ribcage and the pelvis, all three connected to each other through the spine, which is shaped like an S-curve, thus responsible for the balancing of the head, ribcage and the pelvis. Coming back to the idea of forms, you can see that I have simplified these three masses into simple forms. It's the same idea that it allows us to see the basic framework of a figure without getting lost in the anatomical details. Now, once we have simplified the figure into basic forms, the next task would be to maintain that feeling of form in the poses that we draw or create. And this is where we'll get back to the idea of wrapping lines. Here, again you can see these forms that I showed you earlier. But now you can see these lines along the surface, which helps in reinforcing the illusion of these forms. In the sphere, you can see the lines traveling across its curved surface. In the cube, you can see the lines travel straight along its flat surface. And similarly in the cylinder, you can see these lines travel along its curved surface as well as its length. This is one of the best ways to understand the forms and convince the viewer that what they're seeing has volume and occupies space. We can apply this same idea to the human anatomy as well. I have drawn the ribcage, as well as the pelvis can be drawn in the similar way. On the left is what the ribcage and the pelvis bone actually look like, and the next two are their simplified forms. Notice how these lines help in understanding the form as well as the orientation of these masses. You can easily tell that both the ribcage as well as the pelvis are slightly tilted as per their connection to the spine. For the head, I believe you guys must have understood what its form looks like. I have already made a few videos about the head, but you can also use a sphere if you want to keep it simple. And this is how we can authentically represent these anatomical masses using simple forms. This will help you to create convincing figures without compromising the integrity of the human anatomy. However, before we finish, there is one more step, which is connecting these forms together. We can't have a complete figure until the anatomical masses are connected together. I'm sure you do not want your character to have parts floating in the air, unless that's what you want to go for. Here, you can see these two cuboidal forms with a smaller one connected to the top of the larger one. In order to integrate the two forms, notice how I've used the surface lines once again. The lines from the bigger cuboid continue onto the smaller cuboid, giving an illusion that the smaller one originates from the top of the bigger one. In the second drawing, you can see the same idea being utilized. In this case, I have connected a cylindrical form at the bottom of a sphere. The surface lines continue from the sphere onto the cylindrical tube or vice versa, giving the illusion that the two forms are part of one. Now, the third drawing looks similar to the second one, but you'll notice that I have used two forms with different surfaces. The egg-like form has a curved surface, while the other one is a cuboid with flat faces. If you look closely, it's not that different from the other two examples. The surface lines start from a curved surface and then continue onto the flat surface of the second form. This is really helpful when you want to connect various anatomical forms together. It's even useful in later stages when adding muscles. Gathering information can be beneficial, but only when you actually put it to use. At last, the only thing left to do is to take all this information and show you how this can be applied to figure drawing. Let's study a reference pose using the idea of forms. I assure you that by the end, you'll have a new layer of understanding at the figure drawing and gesture. As usual, I have this pose reference that I'll use here. In my experience, it's better to use real-life references when you're beginning. Later, you can try with stylized art such as anime, comic, manga, and so on. I'll start with the head. I'm laying out the basic information such as the eyebrow line and the center line of the face. Moving on to the neck. Try to recognize the curves that form the contour of the figure, such as this S-curve from the shoulder to the glutes, and another one from there to the foot. Now let's draw the arms. You might observe that sometimes the curves that I mark are different than what you saw in the reference. And that's fine. You do not have to copy the exact thing that I did. You can draw what you see in the reference. For the hands, I'll just draw the basic shapes. No details. Now the abdomen as well as the other leg. While drawing a gesture as a beginner, it is quite difficult to recognize the subtleties in the pose and convey the emotions. Obviously, you do not have much experience at the start. So what you can try is to exaggerate the poses. Look for the curves that you can see in the pose and try exaggerating them and see if it works. At least that will prevent your drawing from looking stiff and boring. So the gesture is complete. Now we can focus on the underlying forms that create this pose. Let's start with the head. The cranial mass can be represented with a sphere and the jaw below it. The ribcage is like an egg-shaped form, so we'll go with that. And do not forget the center line. You might not notice, but the center line of all the three masses is important, as it conveys the orientation of each one of them. Now comes the time for the surface lines. You can also call these wrapping lines. So these lines move along the surface of the form and reveal the form underneath, which is the egg shape. If you have worked on a 3D software, this is what you'll see in a mesh view. The abdomen can be simplified into a cylinder or a cuboid. I'll go with the cylinder. This acts as an intermediate form between the ribcage and the pelvis, and the egg shape of the ribcage joins into the cylindrical form of the abdomen. Now, what I'm gonna do is continue the surface lines from the ribcage onto the abdomen. This will create this illusion that both the forms are part of one. Moving on to the pelvis. I'll start with a cuboid. and we'll extend those surface lines here as well. As we have successfully marked the forms for the three main masses, now we can move towards the limbs. So the limbs can be easily represented by cylindrical tubes, one for the upper arm and another for the lower arm. And here too, we'll draw those surface lines or wrapping lines. In fact, you can determine what the lines will look like depending on whether the form is moving towards you or receding away from you. Here, his upper arm is moving towards us while the lower arm is receding away. And the lines help to reinforce this idea of movement in space. Similarly, I'll draw the other arm. For the legs, you can use the similar cylindrical forms. You can tell that both the thighs are moving towards us while the part below the knee away from us. And we're done here. But before I finish, I have another one of this study with a different pose. This pose is also done in the similar way, beginning with creating the gesture drawing and then identifying the forms at play here. Guys, now you have the power to break down any pose that you come across and understand the geometry involved in the human figure. I'll urge you to practice this power, and in time, this shall give you an advantage compared to a lot of other artists. So this is it for now. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give a thumbs up, and if my content appeals to you, consider subscribing to the channel. If you have ideas about tutorials that you would like to see on this channel, please do share a word in the comments. See you later. Bye.